Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my continuation of my book reading of Stephen King's Misery. I'm at chapter 19 called Another Visitor. I won't scream, he said, the window totally awake now, totally aware that the police car he was seeing was as real as his left foot had once been. Scream, you fool, scream! He wanted to, but he could hear Annie's voice saying, "Don't you dare scream." When he tried to scream, his voice dried up, and his mind was filled with pictures of the axe and the electric knife. He remembered that sound. He remembered screaming then, but not to gain attention from anyone. He tried again to open his mouth and failed. He tried to raise his hands and failed. A faint low sound broke out from between his lips, and his hand moved lightly on the side of the typewriter. But that was all he could do. Nothing which had happened in the past, except perhaps for the moment when he had realized that although his left leg was moving, his foot stayed still. It was as terrible as the hell of not being able to move. In real time, it didn't last long, perhaps 5 seconds, but inside Paul Sheldon's head, it seemed to go on for years. He could escape. All he had to do was break the window and scream, "Help me, help me, save me from Annie, save me from the dragon lady." But at the same time, another voice was screaming, "I'll be good, Annie. I won't scream, I promise. Don't cut off any more of me." He knew he was frightened. He knew he was frightened of her. But he hadn't realized until now the extent of his fear. His mind told him that he was going to die anyway. As soon as he had finished the book, she was going to kill him. So if he screamed, and if the policeman saw him, and if that made Annie kill him now, what was the difference? Perhaps 2 weeks of life? There's not much to lose then, and a lot to win. So scream, Paul, scream. What's the matter with you? Are you already dead? The policeman got out of his car. He was young, about 23 years old. He was wearing very dark glasses, which completely hid his eyes and reflected the light like a mirror. He paused just 20 meters away from Paul's window and adjusted his jacket. "Scream, don't scream, scream, and you're dead." "I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. Scream, you coward." Paul forced his lips open, sucked air into his lungs, and closed his eyes. He had no idea what was going to come out of his mouth. Was anything going to come out? "Dragon!" Paul screamed. "Dragon lady!" Now his eyes opened wide. The policeman was looking towards the house. Paul could not see his eyes, but he seemed to have heard something. Paul looked down at the table next to the typewriter was a heavy glass vase, which had been empty for weeks. He seized it and threw it at the window. The glass broke and fell onto the ground outside. Paul thought it was the best sound he had ever heard. It made his tongue free. "I'm here! Help me! Watch out for the woman! She's crazy!" The policeman looked straight at Paul. His mouth dropped open. He reached into his pocket and brought out something, which could only be a picture. He looked at it and then walked a few steps closer. Then he spoke the only 4 words Paul ever heard him say. The last 4 words anyone ever heard him say. After that, he would make a few sounds, but not real words. "Oh God," the policeman exclaimed. "It's you!" Paul had been staring at the policeman, so he didn't see Annie until it was too late. She was still riding the lawnmower, yet she seemed to be half human, half something else. For a moment, Paul's mind saw her as an actual dragon. Her face was pulled into an expression of extreme hatred and anger. In one hand, she was carrying a wooden cross. The cross had marked the graves of one of the cows that had died while Annie was away in her laughing place. When the ground had become soft in the spring, Paul had watched Annie burying the rotten cows. It had taken her most of the day to dig the holes in the ground. Then she dragged the bodies out of the barn with her car and dropped them into the holes. After she had filled the holes in again, she solemnly planted crosses on the piles of earth and said some prayers. Now she was riding towards the policeman with the sharp end of the cross pointed towards his back. "Behind you, look out!" Paul shouted. He knew it was too late, but he shouted anyway. With a faint cry, Annie stabbed the cross into the policeman's back. "Ah," said the policeman, and took a few steps forward. He bent his back and reached both hands over his shoulder. He looked at Paul like a man who was trying to scratch his back. In the meantime, Annie got off the lawnmower and stood watching the policeman. Now she rushed forward and pulled the cross out of his back. He turned towards her, reaching for his gun, and she drove the cross into his stomach. The policeman at that time fell on his knees, holding his stomach. Annie pulled the cross free again and drove it into the policeman's back between his shoulders. The first two blows had perhaps not gone deep enough to kill him, but this time the wooden post went at least 5 centimeters into the kneeling policeman's back. He fell face down onto the ground. "There!" Annie cried, standing over the man and pulling the cross out again. "How do you like that, you dirty bird?" "Annie, stop it!" Paul shouted. She looked at him. Her dark eyes shone like coins, and she was grinning the grin of the madman who has stopped controlling himself at all. Then she looked down at the policeman again. "There!" she cried, and stabbed the cross into the back again, and then into his neck, and then into his thigh and his hands, and into his back again. She screamed, "There!" every time she brought the cross down. At last, the cross broke. Annie threw the bloody and broken cross away as if it no longer interested her and walked away from the policeman's body. Paul was sure that she would come and kill him next. At least, if she did intend to hurt him, he hoped that she would kill him rather than cut 80 more pieces of his body. Then he saw the policeman move. He was still alive? The policeman raised his head off the ground. His glasses had fallen off, and Paul could see his eyes. He was very young and hurt and frightened. He managed to get up onto his hands and knees, but then he fell forward. He got up again and began to crawl towards his car. He got about halfway when he fell over again. He struggled up again. Paul could see the bloody marks spreading on his uniform. Suddenly, the sound of the lawnmower was louder. "Look out!" Paul screamed. "He's coming back!" The policeman turned his head with a look of alarm on his face. He reached for his gun. "That's right," thought Paul. He got his gun out. "Shoot her!" Paul screamed. But instead of shooting her, the policeman's wounded hand dropped the gun. He reached out his hand for it. Andy pulled the wheel of the lawnmower tractor around and ran over the reaching hand and arm. The young man in the police uniform screamed in pain. Blood stained the grass. Annie pulled the lawnmower around again, and her eyes fell for a moment on Paul. Paul was sure it was his turn next. First the policeman, then him. When the policeman saw the lawnmower coming for him again, he tried to crawl under the car, but he was too far away, and he didn't even get close. Annie drove the tractor as fast as she could over his head. Paul turned away and was violently sick on the floor. And that was the end of chapter 19, Another Visitor. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.